Our firefighting techniques are really a product of the built environment that we're working in.
Absolutely.
So if you look at our American colleagues, we can sometimes be critical of them, but they have an awful lot of lightweight construction. They have a lot of timber frame construction, and they really have a tougher job sometimes than we do. So they're first of all keen to get a lot of water on real quick.
Yeah.
Whereas that our confidence in the type of structure that we're dealing with in general, now I know this is a generalization, will say that we're comfortable that most of the time the fire will stay in the compartment of origin. Our colleagues across the Atlantic don't have that confidence. The more exposure that people have to different officers and to different people, I think develops people and I think keeps them fresh.
Yeah.
So for me, I think it's important. The flip side is if you don't move them and they think 20 years of experience is important when sometimes they have 20 years of 1 year's experience. Every fire service they're quite conservative in their outlook.
Yeah.
They tend not to like change, and so I took my own leave. I went over on my own time. In fairness to UL, they paid all the airfares, all the hotel accommodation, and it was a pleasure. Like, I didn't see it as a sacrifice. But my own organisation is a very, very good organisation, but they wouldn't necessarily see innovation or foreign, as they would call it, approaches to firefighting as germane to their outlook. It's my view that the influence of an officer in a firefighter development is monumental, because you could have a guy coming out or training from the training facility, and if he gets an officer who's maybe treading water or he's going through the motions, that really carries right through the shift of people that are working there. Well, what do you want to test? So what the group, which was mostly North American, they wanted to test the transitional attack, the exterior attack, to see if it worked and it wasn't going to push fire. In other words, push the fire deeper into the structure. Yeah. They wanted to test branch, or they call them nozzle techniques. And they wanted to test different styles of smooth bore nozzle techniques. They also wanted to look at the effect of applying water to people that needed to be rescued, in other words, the steam production. And they asked the non-Americans, what did we want? So we said, well, I'd love to see what is the limitation of gas cooling.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Firefighters podcast. My guest today is District Officer John Chubb of Dublin Fire Brigade. Now, John has had an incredible career, and John has been hugely influential in transforming Dublin's response to tall and complex buildings over the last 10 years. He has travelled to such areas as Canada, France, Germany, Sweden, Poland, UK and USA, taking lessons from every stop, combining those examples of good practices and adopting them into his own service. He has worked with some of the most influential people in the sector, including Paul Grimwood, John, Norman, Jerry, Tracey, Michael, Reick and Stefan Svenson. John introduced the novelty pieces of equipment into Dublin Fire Brigade like smoke curtains, smooth bore nozzles for high-rise firefighting, 52mm hose, Denver packs, and different hose deployment methods for management into the trainee initial development courses. He's also a fantastic compartment fire behaviour training instructor known around the world. Other fantastic achievements of his is being on the panel of experts for the UL FSRI experiments titled Impact of Fire Attack, utilising interior and exterior streams of firefighting safety and occupant survival. Now we're going to go into loads of different detail in today's episode. We really do stretch so far and wide across different aspects of CFBT, of firefighting methods and firefighting mindsets. John is somebody I've really admired for quite some time, so it's a pleasure to have him on the podcast. Now, before we jump in there with John, let's take a look at our partners for today's podcast. These are the organisations and companies that we believe can add real value to your life, so the best way to support the podcast is to check out our partners. First up today is the wonderful William Wood watches. These are a luxury watch brand with some fantastic history in the industry. Late grandfather of the owner, William Wood, was in the British Fire Service for 25 years. Now his grandson, Johnny, runs the company, celebrating these heroes, sharing that courage, that bravery, and keeping the dream alive with the role models in the fire service all over the world. When you jump over to the website, you'll see their Valiant collection, the Bronze edition, the Chivalrous collection, and new this year out was the Triumph collection. I wear it when I'm swimming, when I'm diving, when I'm training, and of course when I'm out there in my operational role on the front line. They go into some great detail with them as well. I love when I look at the 12 on mine, it's actually got those two collar markings as it's 12, and then if you switch it on its side, it's even got the British brass Firefighters helmet on the inside of the watches. I was speaking with Johnny recently about the new Triumph collection, and when you flip them over, if you look at the back of the watch, it actually says on it, in case of fire, break glass, with that William wood on the inside of it. It looks fantastic. I mean, the ideas and the innovation that's gone into these. It's waterproof, it looks good, it feels good, it gets the job done. So for more information, head over to williamwoodwatches.com and check out their beautiful collection right now. The best way for you to support the podcast is to jump on over and have a look at some of our partners. We don't just pick them arbitrarily. These are people, organizations, and brands that we've developed a relationship with because we sincerely believe they're going to add value to yourself. So those are our partners for today's podcast. Now, I hope you've got a pen and paper ready. We're going to go in lots of directions with this one, and there will be so many golden nuggets to take away from it. So if you are sitting comfortably, let's buckle up for safety, and I will see you crazy cats on the other side.
Hiya, Pete.
John, how you doing, boss?
How are you? How are you?
I'm fantastic, my good man.
Good.
How is life over there, brother?
Very good. We really have all the doubts as everyone else when we seem to be popping in out of, we have this COVID sorted and then we find out we don't. So there's kind of a level of uncertainty, really, what's going to happen for Christmas and the new year, because we've a 95% vaccine rate.
Wow, that's impressive.
And well, we thought it was, but it hasn't stopped it.
We were patting ourselves on the back for a second then until they said, and no, it doesn't apply. Sorry, it doesn't count.
No. So it's back to square one.
Yeah, well, hopefully not completely square one. I know some crazy stuff has just come out in the UK. I don't know if it's today or tomorrow. I don't actually watch the news. I haven't watched the news in years. Some toxic stuff.
Depressing.
Yeah, exactly. I always say to people, you've got to stand guard at the gateway of your mind. You've got to be super careful what you're allowing in there. And I think so many people are just subconsciously allowing a lot of that. I'm not a conspiracist or any of that craziness, but some people really don't appreciate. Even people say like, oh, it's not going in. I don't really. I'm like, look, that's how subliminal marketing works. It's all going in. Whether you think it's going in or not, stand guard. And I even say this on fire stations, when people say about, oh, so-and-so's a bit negative, but I don't let it bother me. I'm like, dude, you've got to be careful. Be careful who you put yourself around, because those mindsets will bleed into you. They permeate into your mindset. You've got to be careful.
I agree.
I have got a myriad of notes, and I might take a few notes during it, but I want to be incredibly respectful of your time as well. And I appreciate it's a Sunday evening, and I really appreciate you making the time for this conversation.
No, I'm very honoured to be able to, contribute to this. I wouldn't consider myself anything other than someone who learns from other really, really talented people.
Yeah.
So if I can communicate that willingness to learn from other people, I've succeeded. So I really am honoured to take part.
I really appreciate that, brother. And I always say to people, I kind of had this whole imposter syndrome for quite some time at the beginning of the podcast, because I found it hard, gearing myself up to speak to people such as yourself and others. And I thought to myself, you know what? It's not about me, because what I love most about this is I feel like I'm creating little time capsules, little audible time capsules, so that people will be able to come back to this in a year, 5 years' time, and learn and distill all of that knowledge from people such as yourself and a library of other interesting individuals from across the emergency services. So it makes it easier for me, because I can ask those. I mean, there's no such thing as a stupid question, but I can ask all those questions that I feel people are going to get the most benefit of. And I apologise, like some of these might seem a bit in depth. Fire
away, Pete. I'll give it my best shot, and I think I'm happy enough. But you've given me really good notes. Beautiful. And I've taken my own based on those, so they're really comprehensive. So thank you.
I always say to people, it's not thrown together. I always want to make sure that I do a good bit of research, and I sincerely, it helps when you're interested. Do you know what I mean? I'm really interested in the people that I speak to, so I always go into the details and watch things and read things, and I don't want people to feel like we're just asking a bunch of generic questions we'd ask anybody, because that would just feel really false to me. Oh, I was going to ask as well, in your mind, what would this feel like for it to be like an absolute home run, for it to be something that you were really proud of?
That we cover, first of all, everything that you intend to cover. And at the end of it, you don't say, or I say to myself, God, I wish I had said that, or I wish you had asked that.
Yeah.
So that would make it the best possible, interview.
Beautiful. Let's go for it. John Chubb, welcome to the Firefighters podcast. How you doing, boss?
I'm good, and I just want to thank you, Pete, for having me on. I have some great friends in the UK, particularly in the fire service, and it's great to communicate with you or anybody that's interested in what I have to say.
most definitely. I think you've completely undersold it there. I mean, we already recorded a bit of a pre-intro before we came into this, And I found I almost had to not read the intro twice because I probably would have not done the podcast if that had been the case. It's quite overwhelming. Really taking advantage of some of the development opportunities that you've had in your career. But for anybody that is completely unfamiliar with yourself, could you just give us a background on why you chose to join the fire service and sort of where you've been based during your career?
Peter, I joined the fire service by accident. I was a post office clerk and making lots of money doing overtime. And a friend of mine in the post office said, I'm going to go for the fire brigade. And I didn't really have much interest because I was saving for a house at the time, and the fire service was an unknown. So I went with it just to keep him company. And as it turned out, he didn't get it, and I did. And
that must have been awkward.
so it was a bit of a shock, and I started off in the training centre, which is known as the O'Brien Institute. And at that particular time, Dublin Fire Brigade was going through a period of really big investment. And it was on foot of the Stardust tragedy. 48 people died. So at that time, they were putting a lot of money into the fire service. As you probably know, this is unfortunately the trend that when a disaster happens, we get big funding to improve, and then over the years, things die back and we kind of go backwards until the next disaster. But at that particular time, that training centre, they just bought a very impressive old building from the Christian Brothers, and they were putting a lot of money into it. I passed out, and the way they did it then was they sent you to the central station for about 6 months, and then you did your ambulance course, because Dublin is a fire-based EMS.
Wow, yeah, you've got the... I just wanted to pause there for a second, sorry, because a few people listening that aren't familiar with the fire service, when you say pass out, that means graduate, that means you complete your... Some people might be hearing that and thinking, well, you passed out during training school? But yeah, so you completed your fire training, graduated, and then you went and did the EMS as well. That's awesome.
Yeah, very militaristic, the style of training. So then you start off in the central fire station, and then you're basically a relief crew, which means you go around all the stations when they're understaffed. And it's a great thing, really, because you got experience in every single station in Dublin. And I was 15 years as a firefighter, very, very happy. And then after 15, I went for promotion, and I got sub-officer. In my firefighting side of things, I always try to work in the busy stations. Usually, as you can imagine, the inner city stations are areas of social deprivation, and they tend to be the busier stations. And at 15 years, I got sub-officer. 2 years later, station officer. I know you guys use different terminology over there now. And then about 6 years ago, a district officer or a divisional officer in UK parlance. And I've had, consecutive secondments to the recruit training, became a CFBT instructor, obviously SCBA before that, and tactical ventilation. And so I've been in and out of the training centre, and they do it slightly differently here. You don't go out for a couple of years. You go out for a couple of months and go back on the watch. And at the moment, I've just recently taken up a new position as a project lead in organisational intelligence, which is a big change and a new challenge, really, which is, I think, important to challenge yourself. So that's been my time. So about 35 years, and I've loved every minute of it. I've been very lucky, and the brigade has been very good to me. So I really had a great time.
You've made when I hear you talking there, you've made so many great points that kind of my mind wants the bomb burst out. I know we've got a structure that I kind of want us to speak to, but I want to double click on a few things just there. People will hear and experience some of the stuff you've been involved with as we go through our conversation today. But I didn't actually know, and I'd done a fair few hours of research into you, that you'd done 15 years as a firefighter first. And you also said a great thing about moving around stations. So we have things in the UK and different places across, we'll call it resilience teams, that do similar to that, where they will work in different stations as and when they're required. And I love that approach. Some places are a bit averse against it, and they think that people will have a bit like an inconsistent message. But I think you benefit so much, the breadth of development you get from working with. Because I always say, whenever I move stations, and I try and do it every sort of year or two, to be honest, maybe 2 years maximum, people go, "Oh, do you not enjoy where you are?" And I said, "Love it. Yes, I absolutely love it." So why do you want to move then? Because I said, I also realise I'm humble enough to know that there's so many more incredible people out there in the fire service, and I don't want to limit myself just to the wonderful people that I'm working with now. So many people have had different experiences, and do you you work in operational intelligence now, do you still see the benefits of recruits or firefighters switching stations? Because there is also benefits of people embedding themselves and getting really efficient and slick with a team after working for a number of years. So how do you strike that balance in your mind?
I think you're right. It is a balance, but I think what you're trying to do is not make people institutionalized. Like, that's my bed.
Yeah.
That's my table.
That.
That's where I like to sit.
Yeah. Oh no, so and so sits there. I'm like, whatever, mate. Sit wherever you like. Don't be that guy. Crikey.
Yeah. And every station has its own quite separate risks. So I'll give you an idea. Same as your own experiences. I'm sure we have stations like the one I've just moved out of, which Swiftwater Rescue is their big thing. There's stations with Highline Rescue. There's stations that specialise in different elements of the job, and they get more of it. With people that do hazmat. And I think the more exposure that people have to that, and to different officers and to different people, I think develops people, and I think keeps them fresh.
Yeah.
So for me, I think it's important. And the flip side is if you don't move them, and they think 20 years of experience is important when sometimes they've 20 years of 1 year's experience.
That's you make such a fantastic point. And when people go, this is kind of like age as well. This is like a fire service and a non-fire service analogy, because people go, I'm 40 years of age, so I don't need to know that. Or, you say, oh, I've been in the job for 15 years, Pete, for God's sake. Do you not think I know? I'm like, if your perspective has never changed, if you've stood in the same place, looking at the same thing in the same way, then your perspective is going to be so incredibly limited. You have to be able to move and transition through different angles. Even if you're only there briefly, even if you only stand at the side angle for 10 minutes, you will have a different three-dimensional observation of the thing, and your own biases will have changed. The way that you have a filter on life will have changed. So even like you use Swiftwater Rescue as an analogy, the different powers and hazards and the way that the water moves and the hydrodynamics and stuff like that gives you a different lens of perspective when you are doing compartment firefighter behavior training or something like that, because air flows in a similar fashion to what water flows in.
Yeah.
But it will give you a different way that you look at it. And then even when you go to another incident, like you say hazardous materials, something like that, it's just another layer of perspective which you're able to map on top of something, and you can almost like filter through all of those perspectives to give you a more holistic view of a risk or of an incident. Like you say, experience and knowledge don't correlate. People think, oh, I've been around for 20 years, I should know that by now. If you've never been exposed to it, you're effectively experiencing it as a child. You might as well be experiencing it as a recruit, because you've not been exposed to it before, so it's still the first time.
100% agree with you. And the other aspect as well is they're experiencing different officers. Because it's my view that the influence of an officer in a firefighter development is monumental. Because you could have a guy coming out or training from the training facility, and if he gets an officer who's maybe treading water or he's going through the motions, that really carries right through the shift of people that are working there.
Yeah.
So I think on balance, obviously we have to balance where a person lives relative to where they work. We don't want to give them a really difficult time to get in and out of work. But I think constant exposure to new people, new methods, and kind of new challenges is the way that people develop. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely. Now, one of the many pieces of work that you have been involved in is where I'd like for us to start, and that is you were a panel of experts you were on a panel of experts for the paper Impact of Fire Attack Utilising Interior and Exterior Streams of Firefighting Safety and Occupant Survival. Hell of a mouthful. A lot of these papers don't tend to run off the tongue. So for listeners' benefit, this is a piece of work that conducted in Northbrook, Illinois, so it was a USA exercise, highlighted the importance of air entrainment from hose streams on both fire behaviour and airflows within structure. This is a very specific sort of niche in terms of compartment firefighter behaviour training. So what about this subject interested you the most, and what were some of the objectives going into it?
Well, what happened was, first of all, I applied to present at FDIC, which is a big firefighting conference in Indianapolis in the United States.
How did that happen? Come back several layers there, because how did you build up the confidence to do something like that? I certainly, I said before we came on, I don't think I would have the confidence to do something like that. That's a big thing in itself.
Well, I think you would. Sometimes you have to give it a stab. You have to give it a go. Pete. Like, sometimes you have to challenge yourself. So what happened was, I ran a high-rise firefighting conference in Dublin to try and get an appreciation of what was happening. And some American guys came over, some really, really good guys, and they said, why don't you apply for FDIC? So I was accepted, and I gave a presentation on a subject matter called unification theory. And what I was trying to really describe was that we should really be open-minded about North American and European firefighting techniques and strive to achieve a consensus. So
we still struggle with that now, don't we? We still struggle with that a bit now. Do. Sometimes I hear people being very, very critical. Yeah. They see something online or social media or Instagram or something rubbish like that, and it's just like a 5-second clip, and they lose that the holistic view of what they're trying to achieve and what the tactics and the strategies are. We can be very critical.
Absolutely. So what happened then was one of the conference speakers said, would you not apply for FDIC? I went over and did it. And then that led to somebody saying, well, listen, we're really interested in your perspective. Would you not like to go on the technical panel? So I applied for the technical panel, and there was about 4 of us that were not Americans, not Americans. And we were invited to go over and contribute to the research. So that was really interesting because, first and foremost, Underwriter Laboratories, it's an American organization. And it was really designed to test things like fire-resistant cables for alarm system and anything to do with standards. But what happened during the recession in the United States, they weren't getting too much work. So they decided to look for a grant from Homeland Security to do some research into firefighting. And they did. They got money. And they used their huge facility and their fantastic shall we say, capabilities to set up these grand scale of experiments. So the senior researcher was a chap called Steve Kerber, very, very bright guy, and a background as a volunteer firefighter and a fire engineer. And he put this group together, and they got us all together, and they effectively asked, well, what do you want to test? So what the group, which was mostly North American, they wanted to test the transitional attack, the exterior attack, to see if it worked and it wasn't going to push fire. In other words, push the fire deeper into the structure. Yeah. They wanted to test branch, or they call them nozzle techniques. And they wanted to test different styles of smoothbore nozzle techniques. They also wanted to look at the effect of applying water to people that needed to be rescued, in other words, the steam production. And they asked the non-Americans, what did we want? So we said, well, I'd love to see what is the limitation of gas cooling? What's the volumetric limit of this technique? Because I think since it was developed in Sweden back in the 80s, I think we kind of got a bit carried away in believing you could do it in a factory, believing you could do it in a high volume structure. So Steve Kerber agreed to do that. So they looked at water mapping. What happens when you put water on from the outside? Where does the water go? And what's the best way to do it to give the maximum coverage? They looked at, as I said, transitional attack. They looked at flow and move techniques, which means you keep the smooth bore on all the time. And they looked at another technique where you stop, apply water, and then move again. And they also looked at fog firefighting, particularly gas cooling. So on balance, it was an incredible experience. I think the findings were generalizable. In other words, we can all get something out of them. Yeah. And I also think they were reliable because of the academic rigor applied to the experimentation. So it was a really useful way of looking at an American perspective. It was a really good way of seeing the resources that they have, which were pretty astonishing. And it was a really good way of a broader understanding of firefighting techniques worldwide.
And there was, when you say worldwide, there is so many takeaways. And the kind of strikes a balance, because I was reading this paper only a few days ago. There's some wonderful technical data in there, but it's very accessible for anybody who feels like they might feel a bit intimidated by that level of intricacy. But it's a very readable document. It's not a tremendously large document, And there's some real universal takeaways. I wanted to just go deeper into the fact that what was it like getting permission to go and do something like that? Because what position were you actually at in your service at that time? Because it's a wonderful opportunity to be involved in, but
Yeah.
the emergency services, for people that are unaware, is quite unique, and it's not actually the same everywhere, but at times it is very unique, the fact that services will be willing to support people who go off and do this sort of thing. And that's quite a large undertaking. What was the support like in your service at the time for you to go and do this kind of work?
Honestly, I don't want to castigate my own organisation. Every fire service they're quite conservative in their outlook.
Yeah.
They tend not to like change. And so I took my own leave. I went over on my own time. In fairness to UL, they paid all the airfares, all the hotel accommodation. And it was a pleasure. Like, I didn't see it as a sacrifice. But my own organisation is a very, very good organisation. But they wouldn't necessarily see innovation, or foreign, as they would call it, approaches to firefighting as germane to their outlook.
Yeah, you do see a lot of stuff like that where people, they like the idea of development, but sometimes when opportunities come up, they go, actually, that's more suited to so-and-so in the organisation. We've got somebody that would be better for that. But it's often a bit more authentic if it actually comes from the individual who has a personal desire to want to go and do it. And also, want to go on the fact that it is personal development. I think people forget that. I always say you've got to work twice as hard on yourself as you do on the job. If you want to develop, don't be always looking around to your service and going, what are you doing for me? What courses are you sending me on? It's your career. It's your life. It's your personal development. You have got to invest time, resources, sometimes money, personal sacrifice in yourself. Everyone's not going to spoon feed it to you.
I agree, Pete. But here's the thing. It's what we're forgetting. This is great fun.
Oh, yeah. It's a scream, isn't it? It's not like you go into extra hours in a factory, mucking out the back of cookers. It's real scream. I always think it's hilarious that we get the opportunity to do these things.
Incredible. So, like, every moment I've had abroad, firefighters are firefighters everywhere. Well, we've more in common than kind of separated. So any time I've gone over there, I've had a great time. So the same humour, the same self-deprecation, the same, shall we say, borderline craziness. So I had a great time. And I have to say, one thing about our American cousins, they're fantastic hosts.
Oh, yeah, they really are.
Extremely welcoming, and they really are genuinely interested in what we do, but in almost a parental way, kind of a there. What I mean by that is, come here, it's really great what you guys do over there in Europe, but come here, someday you'll catch up with us, kind of thing, But
it's strange, but British firefighting is actually still held in quite high regard. And I've learned this more and more as I've been doing the podcast and working with people internationally. When you do look at a lot of the old documentation, and we do look at where a lot of it's come from, a lot of its origins is from the British Fire Service, and we're kind of like the custodians of that. We have to really be careful, because again, you're still about self-deprecating. I think where the US and some other countries have done really well is they're really good at celebrating each other, and really good at patting each other on the back, high-fiving, chest pumping, all that sort of stuff. We have this like whole stiff upper lip in the UK and in Europe, where we're a little bit less celebratory of each other. And I think some people think I'm kind of corny or a bit too optimistic, but that's the whole point of the podcast, to be honest, is I love to celebrate and acknowledge people, because I think we should. We should do that more. We should be proud. We've got some great stuff. We just need to be proud of it.
Yeah, but I would go, a little bit further than that, and I'd say our American colleagues are totally captured by the hero cult.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's probably a deficit. I think sometimes it kind of captures the whole mentality towards the job. And I think we should be proud of our job. I agree with you there, Pete. But most of us on this side of the Atlantic, we don't see ourselves as heroes.
No.
We don't talk about the job that way. And that would be really, to me, to our credit. I think we do celebrate and we're proud of our profession, but I don't think we want to be seen as heroes. And in fact, I think most of us are a little bit embarrassed by that, you know.
I want us to jump back. We obviously started talking about that study there. I do want us to not neglect different ranges of experiences of people that listen to the podcast. So I want us to just cover the basics first and give people an understanding of what we mean by air entrainment, because it might sound a bit of a technical word for what it actually is, and its relationship to that water application. If you could just expand on that for us.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you how it started. First of all, we were sitting around a table and Steve Kerber outlined the experiments that we're going to do on air entrainment. And initially I was taken aback. What's this about? And the non-Americans that were there were kind of baffled why they were doing it in the first place. Because our view was, this really can't happen if you use a fog nozzle correctly. Okay. So the first thing that we noted was, when our North American colleagues are using fog, they tend to leave it on continuously. And from a European point of view, that was strange, because we were looking at sweeps and pulses. Mm. So we were all aware that you could use a fog nozzle to ventilate a building using hydraulic ventilation, essentially creating a Venturi effect, where the cone creates a low pressure area behind the cone. And as the droplets move forward, the low pressure area tends to pull air, or in this particular case, pull smoke out of the building. As Europeans, we didn't really consider was that if you consider this hydraulic ventilation principle, then when you open a fog nozzle, when you're attacking a fire, you're doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
So you're creating a low pressure zone behind the cone angle, and you're pulling smoke and air behind that cone and pushing it into the fire. And that has a tendency to pressurize that space. It can also cause a thermal inversion, in other words, cause the hot stuff to come down to the level of the firefighter. Mm-hmm. And it can also cause the fire to intensify. So if you think about the Swedish model, they started their approach with pulses because they understood this. And the short, rapid pulsing that you saw coming from northern Sweden was really to counteract the air entrainment. Mm. So where the Americans were looking at it was from a fundamentally different position. They were looking at it from a constant open bale fog application, where the air entrainment was more pronounced. But in retrospect, when I look at what they were discussing and what they were trying to understand, it does have some influence on European firefighting, particularly if we do, shall we say, a narrow cone, long sweep. So air entrainment was bigger for them because over there, there's diametrically opposed views on smooth bore versus fog nozzle use. And they understood that when they compared a smooth bore or a straight stream to a fog nozzle, that the air entrainment was far less. Yeah. So in some ways, the experiments were to confirm that the problem existed from a North American perspective. And secondly, that the smooth bore technique offered advantages over fog with regard to minimizing air entrainment.
There's so many analogies to take away from that. When you see people simply copying a screenshot, and I think this is how training has kind of developed and really accelerated since we've started using a lot of videos and interactive tools and stuff like that, because when you just see a screenshot or you just see one very short example of something, a principle being used, you can see the what, as in what the person did. Okay, I see what the person is doing. But unless you kind of understand the why behind it and what they're trying to achieve, like say, if you just see an image of that, V-cone heading out of a window and, small circles around it, trying to give the principle of the Venturi effect, something like that, you might understand what they're trying to do. But the difference of short pulses versus long bursts has a dramatically different effect on the internal success, the success internally in the structure. I do just want to zoom out a little bit for people that are unfamiliar with emergency services. And I always think of, people might hear us say Venturi and they don't know what they're on about. I always like to use the example of slipstreams in a car, because I think a lot of people, they'll have travelled in a vehicle before. And when we're talking about straight bore versus sort of wide-angled cone or something like that, if people imagine like following a motorbike, the motorbike might be going just as fast as the larger vehicle, like a motorbike versus a big cab box lorry or something like that. It would go in the same speed. It may have the same principle applied to it, but the slipstream behind it will be almost negligible. You won't notice it. Whereas if you sit behind a large vehicle, when you hit a certain distance separated from it, you almost feel like you're pulled into the slipstream. Anybody that's driven in a vehicle will feel that. And if you had sort of thermal imaging camera on, or if you saw the air behavior, you would see it all being separated at the front of the vehicle and then whipping back in and creating that sort of hollow spot of low pressure. And that's why we sort of get drawn into it. Am I getting a bit lost there, or do you think that works for people who are unfamiliar with it?
I think that's a really good explanation, Peter. I like it.
Okay, so when we were looking within the paper, it details several different applications, some of which you've spoken about there. Different variations including smooth bore, straight stream, narrow fog. I want to talk about the patterns. So again, when you just see somebody switching a hose on and then they just seem to be waving it around, it almost, to some people, it might seem aimless, and they don't appreciate that there actually is a little bit of strategy and tactics. So there was sort of the patterns that we use in there was like an N, an O versus a Z pattern. So it really got quite granular in the details of how and why we should be using it and the different applications and the different successes, because you guys were taking temperature readings and, assessing the environment continuously, and all these notes are in the paper as well. So with people that are less familiar with that, could you expand on the different variations and how that applies to the firefighter in the compartment themselves?
Yeah, sure. There's 1.2 million firefighters in the United States. So I think there's about 36,000 different fire departments, and they've all developed their own way of doing it. And people, because of vicarious experience, would argue quite, passionately why their particular technique was better than the other. So what they did at UL was they looked at some core techniques that everyone agreed with. The O technique was simply moving a straight stream, as the letter describes, in a circular fashion. The Z, or the Z as they call it, was moving the stream in that pattern along the ceiling. And then this pattern that you saw, wall, ceiling, wall, where they're moving back and forth, was another favourite technique for different departments. So what UL were trying to do was understand what was happening. And they measured it quantitatively. So in other words, rather than people saying, yeah, that worked well, they measured each technique against the impact on the heat and the temperature and the visual cues they were seeing.
Yeah. So just there, sorry, because I wanted people to just fully get it. When we were measuring the temperatures, there would be different temperature probes at different height levels down the compartment, so they could see. Just because people might be like, "What? How? Was it just how it feels? It felt hotter?" No, there was actual technical data at different levels of the compartment, and you could see per application how it dropped. Yeah. Sorry, just wanted to double click there.
No problem. Come here, if I'm speaking, obviously sometimes from a position of seeing it, sometimes
we're terrible at that. As firefighters in general, we can get so into our vernacular, but I always try and pull myself out and think, is this going to make sense to somebody else? But please, carry on.
So then they broke down those patterns into basically a couple of different moves. And one move was you leave the water on continuously, and you do these patterns as you're moving up the hallway, and you leave the water on. And the other one was they stopped and flowed, where the team would pause, they deploy water and move on. And then they compared the two in terms of what they called temperature rebound. So in other words, when the water application stopped, how long did it take for the fire to redevelop, or the temperatures to rebound, as they called it? And what they found was that if you go with a continuous flow and use either an O pattern or a Z pattern, or what they call a wall, ceiling, wall technique, where you aim the stream where the wall meets the ceiling, you move the water stream across the ceiling to where the opposite wall meets the ceiling, and left it on continuously, it gave the most effective result in terms of pushing back the heat flux or the heat layer away from the firefighters. It gave the longest rebound time. And what they thought was happening was something they hadn't considered before, in that the impact of cooling the linings of the structure, the ceiling and the wall coverings, probably gypsum board, was having a far better impact on the temperature of the gases and the temperatures of the walls themselves, and had a tendency to push back the heat layer. It was working better than anything. So they will actually say in that report, the flow and move technique continuously gives the best result. But that's quite difficult to do, Pete.
Yeah, and
It's
also,
very difficult.
and again, I know I'm talking from such a bias, as I know everybody listening, but I just think that's such a massive application of water. I just feel like it just feels less controlled. And I know, and I say it again, I'm operating out of my own bias, but I always see, and I don't want to be offensive to any of our international listeners, but I see the British, I try and think of us, and even just, the UK in general, as like the thinking man's soldier, the thinking man's firefighter, and not just more is better, bigger is better, more is more is more. And I prefer to be a little bit more tactical in my approach, and like you say, trying to move and continually apply. I don't know. I know it's from where I've been trained, but it just feels like unnecessary amount of water. I always think that we do more damage with the amount of water that we put into properties versus what gets done with the fire itself sometimes.
I agree, Pete, but there is a caveat. The American approach seems to have a binary thought process to firefighting, that it's all or nothing. So the fires that they're, shall we say, talking about in UL are these fully developed fires. When you ask them about what happens when it's just a mattress, what happens when it's just a pot on a stove, they tend then to be less, explanatory about what's going on. So where I think we can learn from their experience is this, right? I think the European approach of having a measured water application against the level of risk or against the level of fire development we're dealing with is the right approach. Now, the caveat that I would add to that is we also need to understand what are the limitations of the gas cooling or offensive firefighting approach. So here's where it got really interesting. They had a structure that they called a ranch-style dwelling. And in terms of its length, it was about 17 meters long and about 10 meters wide. And for the experiments involving smooth bore tactics, shall we say, this place was compartmented. So it had a hallway going to, a bedroom on foot. Now, for the gas cooling experiment, they stripped away all of the compartments. So we had an area now of 150 square meters, and the fire was shielded by a wall of gypsum board. And they let the firefighters attack the fire from the furthest end of the building. And the problem was the gas cooling didn't work. But I should add that it wasn't European firefighters doing gas cooling. It was American firefighters that had very minimal training. Yeah. But the gas cooling did not work. So what do we take away from all of this? Well, first of all, I think for domestic-sized compartments, gas cooling works very well. And when we find a fire, we should be switching to a straight stream and dealing with the burning surfaces with big droplets of water. That's for sure. But what we need to take away from the American experience is when we move to enclosures bigger than domestic dwellings. And in that situation, we've got to realize we've gone beyond the limits of pulsing and small droplets. Yeah. And we have to think about the smooth bore techniques and use more surface cooling techniques. So what did I get out of this? And I think we can all get something out of it, is a realization that there's a limitation to European techniques. A realization that if you talk about compartment firefighting, you also need to start thinking about structural firefighting. And then if you're thinking about structural firefighting, you need to be thinking about different techniques than you use in a domestic dwelling. So that's what I got out of this.
And there's lots of takeaways there as well, because I think in Europe and certainly in and around the UK, our compartments do tend to be a bit smaller. For anybody that's travelled internationally, certainly been into America, a lot of I mean the construction is similar, but everything's tend to be a little bit bigger. Lounges, properties, even the land that a lot of these properties sit on. It's a bigger country at the end of the day. So whilst the population density is also quite spread out in comparison to us, their properties always tend to be a little bit bigger. So you can't just have the one size fits all. And you made a great point, and I think it's kind of universal law. So I just wanted to give it to people in that respect, is this point of diminishing return on a tactic, a bit like water application. it's effective to a certain point under a certain set of conditions, and that's similar to exercise or money or anything like that. You know, some things will require some funding to fix a problem, but funding past a certain point will be a diminishing return. It'll actually have an adverse effect, similar to the over-application of water, similar to exercise. You know, you might say, oh, you're unfit, but you can't exercise 10 hours a day every single day because you're going to injure yourself. And so even in that respect, there's always a point whereby you went with the right intention and your application was appropriate for this set of circumstances. However, we have to have the self-awareness to know that, like when you said about larger properties and larger compartments, people may think of, you know, some of the industrial buildings that we see across Europe and across the world, factories, industrial units. That's where those same applications will be significantly less effective if we're just looking at the short pulse approach. For sure.
And I think if you look at the experiences we're having on this side of the world, and I'm going to quote Shirley Towers, where people were pulsing.
That's a really good. If people aren't sure about that, there's a great case study. You can find it easily on the internet. Shirley Towers. Sorry, go on.
People found the fire, and there's guys above you in the floor above, and the guys were pulsing. They're right near the fire. They're right on top of the fire, and they're pulsing there for 20 minutes. Yeah. And I think that's down to the teaching techniques that we've both implemented incorrectly. And I know you're going to probably come back to this later, but the understanding that gas cooling is not fire suppression, gas cooling is not fire extinction, and gas cooling is simply a technique to get you where you need to be to put water on the burning surfaces.
That's the point.
And which brings me to the next point. With gas cooling, and I'm a CFBT instructor, as you know, there's huge skill decay. Huge skill decay, because we cannot bring the guys out once a week to play in containers. And as a result of that, what the Americans have done is they've taken a very pragmatic approach to this, in that they've made the branch techniques very simple. You've seen them in the study. Move the branch around really quickly, bounce it off the ceiling and walls, make loads of droplets and big droplets and small droplets, and it works. It's not efficient, but it's effective.
Yeah, that's it. And this is when you say effective, in so many things in life, speed wins. And people might go, oh, yeah, but you're doing it wrong. It doesn't matter. That the benefit of fast attack. And this comes again with embedding and ingraining those techniques, making them simple. You know, the old KISS principle, keep it simple, allows people to operate efficiently at speed. Sometimes adding too many layers of complexity and too many different nozzle patterns and too many different variations of pressures and gallons per minute and stuff like that can significantly delay people and almost cause hesitation if they worry they're not applying it in the same way. So there is, like you say, there's a middle point for everybody. But all of that comes just from exposure. But like you said there, it's hard to do. You can't bring people into those tack boxes on a weekly basis.
Agreed. So therefore, if I said to you, Pete, we have a great job coming up here now in the Middle East. It's a brand new fire service we're setting up, loads of money. But the problem is look, we need to get this on the ground fast. If I asked you a question and you were dealing with a group of newish firefighters, what techniques would you teach if you had to do it quickly and cheaply and effectively? Would you go with the complex, high skill model, or would you go with a more simple model?
No, I'd want them safe and I'd want them successful. So that would fall into that, is nothing tremendously complex, because obviously you've got the language barrier. But a lot of people that join the emergency service are quite kinesthetic learners, and that's the beauty of things like gas cooling. Is I'd fill out the application tomorrow, by the way, just on a side note. I would love to do something like that, because I'm a serial learner. You know, I'm the relentless, eternal student. I love being in that environment. I think that's why the podcast has come to its sort of fruition in this respect, because I love going over those basics. You can never touch on the basics too much.
I agree.
I wanted to move next, because you mentioned there about your work as a CFBT trainer. Now, you've done a lot of work in this area and lecturing. So given that we've spoken about different methods in terms of structural and internal firefighting, what are some of the key areas around good CFBT courses that you think they all sort of need to include? Okay,
I think the most important thing to consider is to have very clear learning outcomes. And that should be done in an academic way. I'm talking about curriculum development, instructional design. And I would suggest that the first thing I would say about a modern CFBT course is understanding that the use of single containers is very limited. So in a modern course, what I would be looking to do is to do demonstration burns only in containers. I wouldn't do attack exercises.
Okay.
I said the next thing I think we should include is a realistic understanding of fire behaviour in terms of teaching both fuel-controlled fires and ventilation-controlled fires. An awful lot of the models out there are based on fuel-controlled fires only. I would also suggest that the firefighters need to progress to tactical units as soon as they master the basic understandings of the cognitive and the psychomotor skills. When they get to the tactical unit, we're talking then of integrating SCBA, CFBT, or Swedish offensive techniques, as they call them, and tactical ventilation. I think the burns, and I think you were going to ask me this, they don't need to be that hot.
Yes,
that's for modern teaching.
Easy one that you see is when people hear CFBT, they think, like say, lots and lots of chipboard, lots and lots of layers. I want to teach you what it's going to be like to be in an extremely hot environment and how to survive. And that is such a really, someone's probably experienced training at some point and then they've gone on to be an instructor, and their experience was of something that was probably not intentionally extremely hot because they spent time in an attack box for maybe a little bit too long, or the fire was stoked incorrectly. And their takeaway was, it needs to be extremely hot for you to get the benefit of it. And that is not true, is it? You don't have to have something that people are walking away. I mean, you said before, I think, Niels Bergstrom has that great quote. It's one of my favorites. Don't burn to learn, warm to inform. And you can get the takeaways from something that doesn't have to be a raging inferno.
I agree, but I think you've got to contextualise the training that you're delivering. A fire in an ISO container is not a real fire. If you place the boards up halfway up the wall and on the ceiling, that doesn't behave like a real room on fire. The ventilation of that space is probably one door at the back and maybe a vent on the top in certain circumstances. Mm-hmm. The fire behaviour model that's taught is based on homogeneous fire gas temperatures, and whereas that doesn't happen in the real world, where we get pockets that are super hot, you get pockets that are maybe very rich and they're not burning and they could be much cooler. Most real fires will be ventilation controlled and the visibility will be nil. And
why is that? Just double click on that for me, because I think, again, members of the public won't fully appreciate when we say ventilation controlled. What does that mean for people that are unfamiliar with what that is?
Okay, apologies again, Pete. Sorry. Okay, if a fire has loads of ventilation, there's plenty of air getting in, there's plenty of windows open and the door is open. The first characteristics and its development will depend on the type of fuel, the arrangement of that fuel, and the characteristics of that fuel. Now, if you take that same fuel package and put it into a room and close up the room, close the windows and close the door, the fire will be fuel control at the start. In other words, the fuel characteristics will be the dominant feature of the fire development.
And how much is in the room, whether it's a kitchen, whether it's a living room, what is the fuel loading that's within that compartment?
Yeah, it is. But now, if that enclosure is closed up, at some point, the oxygen in the air will start to be consumed by the fire. And then what happens is the fire's development is not controlled by the fuel, it's controlled by the amount of air. And that's ventilation controlled.
Yeah, so it goes from an abundance of air and an abundance of fuel. It starts to burn through its fuel, it starts to burn through its air, and it needs to replace one of them. It needs something adding into that mechanism to keep that balanced triangle, as I'm sure, to go way back to the basics people we're familiar with. It builds up a deficit in the fact that it's lack of ventilation, it's lack of nourishment from oxygen.
So what happens then is the fire burns less efficiently when it's ventilation controlled, and it produces more smoke. The smoke layer doesn't tend to stay halfway up the room. It tends to descend down to near enough the floor.
It's searching more and more for that fuel, isn't it? Yeah.
And that will really be more indicative of how a fire will behave in a modern structure. So when the firefighter arrives at the kitchen or the bedroom on fire and opens the door, he isn't going to see a beautiful flame running across the ceiling. He's generally going to see a smoke layer on the ground.
Yes.
And very difficult to see the seat of the fire. And it won't behave really the way the fire develops in a fuel control demo, which is still the most common demonstration done on this side of the Atlantic.
That might help people a little bit. When we spoke about comparisons of methods, I just want to go on a sidetrack for a second, because when then people look at styles of tactical ventilation, I know it's not something we necessarily were going to speak about, but when people see, American firefighters are very enthusiastic about vertical ventilation and ventilation from the roof. We see people standing on roofs with chainsaws, and people go, my God, they have images of, the old comedy image of people sat on a branch and cutting it and then falling to the ground as they've cut the branch that they're sat on. People have an image of firefighters cutting a hole in a roof and they're going to fall through the roof. And it's, it does happen from time to time, very rare, and they're not just arbitrarily going about it. But could you just expand on when people talk about tactical ventilation as well, and how the vertical versus horizontal aspects can differ?
There are advantages to doing vertical ventilation from a roof. Now, first of all, I wouldn't be in favour because of the risk versus the benefit, okay? But when you ventilate from the roof and create basically a chimney at the top of that structure,
which can sometimes happen on its own. It might have self-ventilated, i.e. it's broken through the roof.
It could happen, yeah. It can happen. Obviously, it's bad news for the building when it's got into the attic. But basically, when you ventilate from above, you are not mixing air with that fire. So if you keep the floor closed and you ventilate from the roof, you're letting a good bit of heat out, and it can really improve conditions. Now, if you get water on quickly. Now, if you ventilate horizontally through a window or a door, well, there is going to be mixing, because the air is coming in more or less horizontally, and it's mixing with the region, in other words, the lower part of the neutral zone, if you want, and it's creating a much better ventilation profile for those gases to ignite and go back into their limits of flammability. Mm-hmm. So there are technical advantages to the roof or vertical ventilation. But when you take it all into balance, do I want guys getting up on the roof with a chainsaw? No.
It just doesn't feel right. Certainly from when people move into different parts of their career and do an incident command perspective, you see anybody going aloft with cutting equipment, you just think, oh no, surely there's a better way.
Well, if you think of where it came from, FDNY started the process. And they had buildings called brownstone. Now, they're basically duplexes. That's probably the best way to describe them. And these used to have the equivalent of a glass window at the top of the stairs. And they used to send a guy up. This is going back 150 years. And the stairwell was full of smoke because it wasn't a protected stairwell. And they'd send a guy up and he'd break this glass window, a scuttle they used to call it.
Yeah.
And it would clear the stairwell of smoke in exactly the same way as an AOV works in a tall and complex building. So that tended to become prevalent all through America, where they were ventilating first and they weren't coordinating ventilation with a fire attack, with a hose stream. And we know that creates its own problems and it can lead to really bad outcomes. But I think the European approach of anti-ventilation from the outset of your firefighting operation and then ventilating quite vigorously when you have water on the fire is probably a better way on balance when you balance up the risk.
You've got a more local understanding, and when I say local, I mean you're in proximity to the fire. You've got a local understanding of what your external effects are having on it, rather than outside you're trying to assess all of these variabilities of what's happening like 2 or 3 stages later than the origin of the location of where the fire is. You're trying to have an effect on it externally when you're not really sure. And this is kind of goes into when people are using positive ventilation phase stages 1 and 2. That can be really scary when you're not sure what effect it's happening, and you're pushing heat and you're pushing fire into different areas and different voids, and it can be scary for people you haven't got eyes on. You're like, what's happening in there? And it's very different.
Yeah, I agree with you, Pete. You see, because of the prevalence of open plan structures in the United States, when you break that window and you put on a fan, you have a very good chance of creating an inlet to outlet or exhaust vent flow because they're open plan. But if you look at the European context, when you try the same context or the same tactic, I should say, there's a good chance there's a lot of compartments between you and the fire and a lot of doors closed. So it tends not to be as reliable or as effective, because how often are you going to get that flow path between the inlet and the outlet in a European context?
Yeah. Even now, because a lot of properties haven't gone through the changes, and I'm going to say the changes, what I mean by that is what we've seen in the last 30 years is a lot of people turning their European properties into open plan. There's like been an explosion of, I want to knock down every wall in the house. And people again forget the adaptations that firefighters need to make when thinking about ventilation. Because like you say, traditionally, a lot of European properties would have a large number of doors, smaller compartments, and it had a very different effect when we look at flow paths and external ventilation, creating ports, creating exhausts prior to commitment.
Yeah, I think we've kind of gone full circle to some degree, and you've hit the nail on the head, Pete. Our firefighting techniques are really a product of the built environment that we're working in.
Absolutely.
So if you look at our American colleagues, we can sometimes be critical of them, but they have an awful lot of lightweight construction. They have a lot of timber frame construction, and they really have a tougher job sometimes than we do. So they're first of all keen to get a lot of water on real quick.
Yeah.
Whereas that our confidence in the type of structure that we're dealing with in general, now I know this is a generalization, will say that we're comfortable that most of the time the fire will stay in the compartment of origin. Our colleagues across the Atlantic don't have that confidence.
No, because as well, we've had different approaches to fire breaks, and I feel like construction, we were a little bit ahead of the time. But also, when you build so many things so quickly in a certain style, it's very expensive to then retrospectively change them. We're smaller countries, so when we make changes in our infrastructure, it's less expensive versus when you throw up millions and millions and millions of houses across the US, and then you have developments in fire safety or fire separation or the materials that are in use. It's very expensive. We've seen this with a lot of the high-rise stuff that we're going to come into with tall buildings. Yeah. When we try to retrospectively apply a rule, it's very expensive. But I wanted to just go off on a tangent because I think it's an important thing for people to consider. You said about we've developed our behaviours based on the environments that we operate in. There was a great thing I read the other day about soccer. So soccer and football. And have you ever heard of futsal? Do you know what that is?
I did, yeah. It's very big with young kids.
That is
here in Ireland,
a great example. So this originated, in my interpretation, from my looking in the favelas of Brazil and stuff like this. Yeah. And it's effectively played with a smaller ball on a significantly smaller pitch. And this was kind of the origin of some of the greatest football players in the world. Because they played with a smaller ball on a smaller pitch, they were getting contact with the ball a lot more. So when you look at, there's a book called Bounce, and they look at the 10,000 hour rule and how you can compress that time through the amount of contact you have with something. So in a game like futsal, people would have contact with the ball a lot more often. They'd have to think faster because a player would be on them a lot quicker and that created better players who could think quicker versus some football and soccer teams that operate on a much larger pitch. You might only touch the ball every 5 or 6 minutes, and then you'd run for ages across the really large pitch. That is how I think, similarly to American versus European firefighting, we operate in smaller buildings with smaller compartments, and it develops a different mindset when we think about firefighting. Does that make sense? Absolutely. And you're getting my imagination going here a little bit. When people say that, it's like a that goes back to our experiences when we talk about working with different people, because everyone's got different experiences. They've got different learnings. Someone that's worked in construction, someone that's coached football teams or something like that will have a different lens and how they look at stuff. And I love it. You kind of go down a rabbit warren with it. Maybe we should set up exercises and tactical units. Definitely. Where they have to repeat forcible entry, search skills, gas cooling, tactical ventilation, and they have to do it so frequently. Yeah. It'd be a firefighting equivalent of futsal. Yeah, run it again. Do you know what I mean? And break up the different stages of something. And just, go in those. I've done drills before where we will put a BA set on and off like 50 times, and that'll be the drill for like 30. And people might hear that and go, "Really? Oh my God, I would hate to be on that watch." But you know what? It becomes something that becomes subconscious so quickly. You can transition from so that you can, because you got to control the controllables. Theoretically, your firefighting behaviours and the equipment that you've got with you should never change. The things that are going to change, the things outside of your control, are the properties that you're turning up to, the people you're interacting with, and those aspects of an environment which are constantly dynamic and ever changing. So you need to get a really solid subconscious ability to be able to do those controllables. So you haven't got to think about those. You shouldn't have to think about those. You shouldn't have to think about setting up the fundamentals of an incident, because you should be focusing on the things that are outside of your control, the things that you're not aware of, which is the address, the premises, the individual, that incident, which is you never go to the same one twice.
Yeah, I agree with you. And to be fair to our American colleagues, their basic foremanship is very, very strong. They're good with their Halligan tools, how they're good with the way they move big hose. And to some degree, we have a love affair with the hose reel, as you know, in this part of the world.
Yeah.
They have developed really good ergonomic, very solid techniques for moving big hose, and they have very structured ways with their instant command and how they search places. So I think the practical component of their foremanship is something to be admired, and it fits perfectly with your descriptor that we make these things muscle memory. And
yes,
I'm all
muscle memory.
I'm all for that.
Love it. I want to change gears now into some of the work that you've been part of over the years in firefighting operations in tall buildings. This actually might be something that people are more familiar with in terms of your working, because this has been, I don't necessarily one of the largest parts, but certainly one of the most impactful things that you've been able to contribute to the services where you operated in. So could you just give us an overarching description of what is classed as high-rise or tall buildings, as people might be familiar with, in terms of the construction and the fire services operational perspective on how this classification differs, again, in different services in different regions?
Well, I can talk about Ireland predominantly, but there's broad similarities with the UK, Pete. So the first thing I'd like to outline is I don't believe firefighters should define high-rise buildings in the same terms or perspective of the construction regulations or the planners. And I'll give you an example. In Dublin, the planners believe a high-rise building is over 50 metres. They believe that a low-rise building can go up to 28 metres. So if you think about that in the context of NFPA, which is the North American Fire Protection Association, they say a high-rise starts at a lower height than the Dublin planners think it does, and they're doing it for 150 years.
Yeah.
So first of all, I would like to say I prefer the term tall and complex.
Yeah.
And the reason being, well, any building that you have to utilise high-rise tactics, it's a high-rise building. Yeah. So if you look at the building, shall we say, the building characteristics that demand these type of tactics, I would say buildings, because of their height, their setback or location, they preclude the use of aerial appliances. I would say buildings that firefighters must heavily depend on the firefighting provisions of that building. Remember, we check our equipment twice a day, 365. These buildings might get these things checked once or twice a year. I would say buildings that have unusually long evacuation times. I would say buildings that challenge our logistical support supply lines. In other words, moving stuff from our fire engines to a remote area, such as a bridgehead, for example.
Easy examples of that, because when people like say, I wanted to double click on that complexity, and I know you're going to elaborate on it, because I often think an easy example is like hospitals, even if they're only 2 or 3 floors. Yeah. And people, well, it's not high rise. Yeah, but the travel distance and the complexity and the compartmentation and how far you are away from your engines, from your other resources. And like you just said there, how reliant you need to be on the infrastructure provided by the building. That's the same. Even if you're only 1 or 2 floors above the ground, the complexity involved in that incident is massive.
I agree. And I went to London. London Fire Brigade invited a load of fire services to really kind of find out what they were doing with tall and complex and high-rise. And there was a chap there from London Fire Brigade, and he said to me, "How many high-rise buildings have you got in Dublin, you know?" And I said, "Thousands of them." And he thought I was pulling his leg. And then when I explained to him exactly as you pointed out, that when you think about it, right, if you're moving up to the 20th floor or the 5th floor, and you're remote from your equipment on your fire engine, and you have complicated, extended command and control lines, we have different types of fire behaviour, and all the different issues that I discussed earlier. Essentially, a firefighter can't tell the difference.
No, past a certain point, it's negligible whether you're going up 80 floors. Do you know what I mean? You're so far away from the limitations that we're able to build into our equipment that it doesn't matter past that point. The principles are the same.
I would agree. And that's the approach we've taken in Dublin. So what I got them to do was break tall and complex into 3 categories. And this directly affected the PDA. And the first category is any building up to 20 metres that our aerial appliances can reach. The second categories were buildings that were residential only, over 20 metres, and it doesn't matter the height after that. And then the third category were buildings that were commercial or a combination of residential or commercial because of the open plan implication for development. So that encourages a different type of predetermined attendance. And it means that we're cognizant that these buildings are going to present with different fire safety provisions. So the one below 20 metres is unlikely to, well, it won't have a dry or wet riser. Probably have a single stairwell, fairly basic alarm system and smoke management. When you go over 20 metres, it will have a dry riser. If it goes over 60, it'll have a wet riser. And if you go into the, shall we say, the commercial, you will probably have multiple stairwells, whereas in the previous two, you'll probably have a single stairwell. So it kind of helps people break down the building into their appreciation of its characteristics.
I just want us to double click on a few of those just before we go too much further. So PDA's predetermined attendance is based on a risk analysis of the requirements for fire provisions of that building. So a PDA might vary in number of vehicles, or we might call them pumps or appliances. That basically means the number of fire engines, the type of fire engines. So whether it's an aerial ladder platform, whether it's a water rescue ladder, a PRL, a WRL, it's pumping capacity. So you said they're about wet and dry risers. People might not understand what they are. So a riser is a vertical pipe that's built into the infrastructure of the building that will have a valve similar to the ones on the back of the fire engine, but have it at every single floor. And this is where we're talking about inbuilt resources, firefighting resources that we can utilize when we go into the building. They're not there for the public, but people will pass these every day. They'll see them on different floors when they get out of their elevators or their lifts. And they'll be behind a glass box usually. And these might differ. You said wet and dry. Wet obviously just means it's pre-charged with water, meaning we haven't got to pump in as much at the base for people to be able to utilize it on every floor when we travel to the base of operation in that building. I just want to double click on that so people understand where we're going so we don't lose anybody. So we were speaking there about the complexity and different structural issues that people might face. One of the things I heard you speak about before was you used an example of Ottawa in Canada and how they defined high-rise. And then we get straight into that vernacular, because one of the things was structures that pose a potential for significant stack effect. So again, I just wanted to ask if you could expand on what is the stack effect, how this occurs, and what challenges that is for firefighters.
Yeah, our normal understanding of smoke as it kind of pyrolyzes from a fuel is that the thermal buoyancy of the smoke will want to make that smoke rise. And as it rises, it might mushroom at some point in the building. So the thing from a tall and complex or a high-rise point of view, that natural thermal buoyancy, it doesn't always prevail, and smoke doesn't always rise. So the example I would give you is a positive stack effect can also be described as a chimney effect, where the building is facilitating smoke going up through stairwells, and the building itself tends to be warmer than outside. So you have a cold winter's day and the building is warm. So the building tends to keep the smoke warm, and the buildings, as the smoke leaves the origin of the fire, it tends to keep rising, and it'll keep rising until it meets a ceiling or maybe the top of a stairwell. Now, let's flip that. Let's say the building is very tall, and let's say the building is air conditioned. So the building is a summertime building. The building is very cold, and outside is actually warmer than the building. Well, in this particular case, as the smoke leaves the compartment, the smoke cools very quickly. And instead of rising, it tends to move downwards.
Exactly.
So a positive stack effect is also known as a winter stack, is smoke tending to rise. And a summer stack effect, it's really very tall buildings in very hot climates, is the smoke tending to move downwards. So what does that mean to us? Well, if we're looking to evacuate a building, and we would say we'd normally target the first floor and maybe the first floor above it. Well, if you had a negative stack effect, which is not that common unless with a really hot day in a very tall building on this side of the Atlantic, the potential area that we might need to evacuate is the first floor and then the floor below. But that doesn't happen, luckily. But in the United States, North America generally, you can get these extremes of temperature where smoke behaves very unnaturally. And so they call that the stack effect.
And people, when they've been to the big city or whatever, when they go to some of the capital cities around the world, it might be the only time that they interact with tall buildings, although they are becoming a lot more common with offices and stuff, and population booming and stuff like that. And people will know this mostly if they've never been in a fire in a tall building. When they just go in at the ground floor, sometimes they think it's a really windy day and the wind has blown in behind them, but actually that's that aspect of when there you go, there's a stack effect. Because when people open the entrance to the building, the rush of air that they experience traveling in behind them isn't anything to do with how windy it is or isn't outside it. It's to do with the internal temperature of that building, the fact that the cold air is rushing in and immediately being drawn up the building because of that stack effect.
Exactly, and that's why they go with the revolving door so often, because it stops that upward draft.
Yeah, it's more consistency rather than, like you say, it makes it harder. The building has to work harder to stabilize its temperature because it's having that constant inrush.
Exactly.
I wanted to expand because we spoke on our PDAs there about aerial ladder platforms. Now, this is something people might hear of, turntable ladders. They might have heard of things that came out many, many years ago, but ALPS, aerial ladder platforms, certainly have been given a lot of attention in the UK since incidents such as Grenfell and other high-rise incidents. There's a lot of investment from some services into aerial ladder platforms, and also the fact that high-rise buildings are becoming, or tall buildings are becoming, more prolific, as we've already said about the booming population, office blocks and stuff like that. What are some of the obvious benefits, but also the limitations of aerial ladder platforms, and how big are some of these? What are some of the largest ones that we're aware of in existence?
Pete, I had to look that one up.
I saw recently that London, I think in like the last few weeks, there was something about one in London. It's massive. I don't even know the height of it. I want to say
64. It's a 64 metre.
Thank you. I didn't want to say that because I wasn't sure if I misquoted it, but I'm glad you've already said it. 64 metres. That is it. For people that are unfamiliar, we tend to, like in the fire, I don't know, I'm going to misquote myself now, but in the UK, in my training, we tend to think of floors as being like 3 meters. If you measured the floors, it's roughly 3 meters-ish, including the floor paneling and stuff like that. So when you look at 60 meters, that's massive.
There's a 112 meter Bronto skylift.
Really?
Yeah. Now,
wow.
But here's the advantage, right? Like the key benefits would be, look, we can operate defensively if we need to. We don't have that capability. We have to put guys in.
Yeah.
We can also kind of execute rescues at higher levels.
Mm-hmm.
We have a better chance to deal with combustible cladding for sure, and we can direct water more accurately. Now, the downside, here's the thing, the building regulations, the approved document B and the Irish version technical guidance document B say that for an appliance, a class B appliance, that the podium above an underground car park should have a weight capability of 12.5 tonnes for a fire engine, and wait for it, 16.25 tonnes for an aerial.
Wow.
Now, our aerial in Dublin is 18 tonnes. We have a 42 metre ladder coming in January, and that's going to be 26 tonnes.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the weight of the London appliance? And can you imagine the weight of that Bronto skylift?
Yeah.
How many areas will they actually fit?
I actually remember seeing one stuck in some slabs outside a high-rise building once, again, because it had just driven onto it to try and, I think they were just drilling positioning and stuff like that. People forget that, and they forget, like you say about London, the amount of structural changes that have happened below ground in London, because they constantly want to expand in every direction, from your sewers to cellars to rail lines and underground and stuff like that. We may very well become, like you just alluded to now, in a position where these things are falling through the ground if we're not careful.
I think that's a concern, because it's very hard to retrofit buildings that were designed to an older standard.
Yeah.
It's not just adding another couple of millimetres of concrete. This is a significant structural change to maybe tube developments, to the structures that are there 20 or 30 years. So I do believe I'd love to have one, but I don't believe they're the panacea to all of our problems.
Yeah. We've got to be careful we're not knee-jerking to a reaction. Do you know what I mean? We can be very reactive to what's popular at the minute. And I always say, it can be an unpopular thing sometimes. I'm like, when you're analysing risk, guys, you've got to think about the likelihood and severity. Now, a lot of people died in the recent high-rise and things, the stuff that have made the news. But how often are these happening? How often are these happening to the extent that our training can sometimes be an easier thing. It's not easy, but sometimes easier and more cost effective and more useful across a wide range of incidents if we just develop our understanding, our technical knowledge, and our ability to apply these different strategies to these sorts of buildings, the work that you yourself have directly involved in, versus having that knee-jerk reaction of building bigger, taller, more expensive, heavier aerial ladder platforms and enforcing everybody go out and buy one.
I think the ideal solution is an improvement in the building standards, the testing of materials, and checking that those, shall we say, those approved plans have been implemented correctly, and ultimately that the management of the building post-construction is at the standard that it should be. Now, in case anybody's listening and they're going to walk away thinking this guy's against aerial appliances, I most certainly am not.
Not at all.
But I do understand that there are limitations, engineering limitations of where we can put them.
Yeah. And you, when people look at some of the tall buildings in inner cities, I mean, Grenfell was a fantastic example. I think, and I don't want to misquote, was one of our previous guests, I think, I don't know if we took it out of the episode or not. There was only one place that the Alp could have gone then. It was lucky that they managed to get it where they did, because when you have a load of fire engines turn up to an incident, the envelope that an aerial ladder platform requires to deploy it, as in the envelope, as in they stick out the legs and then it gives itself a wider platform to erect itself, and then it has limitations to where it can reach so that it doesn't the counterbalance doesn't go outside of that window, where it couldn't carry out an effective rescue anyway, because just because it's big and tall doesn't mean it can. You've got to take into the laws of physics on pivot and fulcrum here. If you can't just extend until just because you've got a longer ladder, you can just keep going forever. There's limitations to its use.
I think it's a multifaceted problem, and I think we have to have multifaceted solution.
Absolutely. Now, one of the first trainings that you were ever sort of involved with on this subject matter, I believe, was done with the Petronas Twin Towers in Kuala Lumpur. Am I right in saying that? Not quite completely right.
I'll tell you what happened was
please do.
One of your best guys, in fact, one of the best guys in the world is Paul Grimwood. And I think sometimes he's undervalued in his own country. Internationally, I think Paul Grimwood is probably the most progressive, the most advanced thinking firefighter I've ever met, and he's certainly been my greatest influence. So,
do you know what? Though? Don't you find that with so many people? Because Paul, you're a great example there. Because if you grow up around somebody, or for people that probably joined training school with Paul Grimwood, he is on our hit list, by the way. He is going to come on as a future guest. Love that guy. You get so familiar with the person, and I always say sometimes you're too close to the subject. You can't see the picture when you're in the frame, and when you're working around somebody like yourself, and I do include you in that. Hence why I wanted to have you on, and Paul. They may not be acknowledged or celebrated as much because you get so familiar with the person and you've seen their development over time. But yeah, some of the learnings that Paul has shared with people are incredible.
Amazing. So he got a contract to train the Malaysian Fire Service in Kuala Lumpur. So his normal colleague couldn't make it. So he rang me and he said, "Will I go over and do the compartment fire behaviour training?"
What an amazing, what an amazing invite to get. Oh my God.
Give me half a second to think about that, Paul. Yeah. Right? So I went over to a training centre in the jungle, about 40 kilometres outside Kuala Lumpur.
Surreal. And how surreal was that?
They had better facilities than we had. It was sensational. Every single thing they had was much better than what we had here in Dublin. They had fantastic students, very devout people. They had to stop and pray a few times a day, and lovely, lovely people. And what happened was Paul was running the high-rise firefighting. So I was very lucky to do CFBT with Paul, and I was also very lucky to sit all through his classes. And I would say he was a couple of decades ahead of his time. Yeah. He's probably still only about 1 decade ahead of his time. But at that time, he was...
when someone goes through, like, if you get separated from somebody and they go away and learn and distill that knowledge, when they come back into contact with people that have not gone through those iterative cycles of learning and studying, their level of interpretation of their subject matter can be so advanced that it's difficult for some people to interact with it, because they've already gone through so many of levels of failure and adaptation and learning and change that other people wouldn't have gone through. So when Paul shares some of his learnings and some of the perspectives that you share, it sounds alien to some people, doesn't it? They're just like, I can't comprehend that. It's so different than what I originally learned. But sometimes we're operating out of dogma from what we originally learned. The materials have changed, the structures have changed. And if people really go deep into some of Paul's work and some of the work you've been involved with, the learnings are just enormous.
I think your explanation there is the best I've ever heard, Pete, in that this chap, Paul, has gone through so many iterative cycles of learning that when he comes back with the finished product of, well, okay, guys, here's where we need to move forward, that they're slightly divorced from the reality of the people they're trying to explain it to. And I think your explanation there is brilliant. And I think Paul's contribution won't be fully realised for a long time. And he has been quite amazing. And there's another guy I'd like to mention as well, Dave Payton, West Midlands guy. He was in their training centre for years and now he's in the Fire Services College. Very humble guy. Oh, his knowledge, his pragmatism, his ability to understand international trends. There's another star that he's a hidden gem. He's an incredible guy.
We'll hunt him down. I wanted to ask you, so from after you'd gone through some of those learnings with Paul, and then you obviously took some of that back to Dublin with you, how did that, when you've like been to the other side and you've seen the light, if you will, and I'm not trying to, make too much of Paul's work, but when you then tried to go back and implement some of that, it's hard to articulate what you've experienced. So talk to me about some of the differences that you took away from what you'd seen and what you'd experienced, and also with the layer of stuff you'd experienced in Sweden, both in tall buildings and low-level premises and CFBT. What was some of the...
Okay, it's a complicated question.
It is. There's too many questions there for you, I know, but...
Paul would have a mid-Atlantic approach to firefighting thinking and tactics. And what I mean by that, he has an internationalist approach to looking at the best from both sides of the Atlantic. And so when I came back after being in Malaysia, it was an extremely frustrating time, probably for the reasons you've already identified, in that I felt that we were so far away from where we needed to be that the task practically and politically was nearly impossible. So what happened was I decided to do things incrementally. So I got them to move.
That's a tough discipline. That's a tough discipline. That really demonstrates. I just want to double click there. That demonstrates the self-awareness of a great instructor when you want to show them step 26, but you appreciate that you had to go through steps 1, 2, and 3 as well, and you have to discipline yourself to slow down so you don't. If you come in too hot, too fast, people just bounce off, don't they? They can't connect with it, and you can't take them with you along that learning journey because you just go too quick. I'm terrible at that. I'm absolutely terrible at that.
Well, I think we all have that problem, but the thing was that I introduced 51 millimeter hose to replace the 45, which gave big hydraulic performance benefits. I reintroduced smooth bores. This was all very gradual. I introduced PPV. I introduced, even more recently, the 2008, the smoke curtain, and they were all of these were elements in the bigger picture. And then you sometimes need a bit of luck, Pete. And if you look, you hear people never fail to take advantage of a disaster. And it's a really good point. We had a very bad fire in a hotel outside Dublin, and nobody got hurt, thankfully, right? But it exposed the deficits that we had. 2 months before that fire, I gave a presentation to the chief about where we needed to go. It was a 2.5-hour presentation. And to a large degree, they were a little bit dismissive. And then what happened, this particular fire occurred. And as a consequence, it kind of focused everyone's attention on where we needed to go. So
we can lose focus quite easily, can't we? We tend to, I always call it toiling while Rome burns. Sometimes we get so absorbed in the minutiae of some of the other things that are happening in the fire service, we lose our observation. But you made a great point as well, and it reminds me of a wonderful quote, which is, when the student is ready, the teacher will emerge. You have to be ready mentally to absorb some of the stuff. Otherwise, it's not a very healthy process and very disengaging process.
I think so. So I think sometimes you do need that little bit of luck, And then when that came along, the entire organisation's view on the capacity changed, and it kind of acted as a what would you say, an accelerant to the process. So I was pretty lucky that way.
Yeah. I kind of think of that, and I don't want to mean this egotistically, but I kind of think about that with the podcast sometimes as well. Because a lot of services are scared of technology and they're scared of open dialogue because they think people were going to accidentally commit professional suicide if they come and have conversations about some sort of stuff. But you've got to be able to teach people and talk to people in a way that they're most receptive to it. And that's why I think it's such a great example of the confidence, self-awareness, and confident in your own skin for people like yourself and some of the other guests I've had on, because the way that I think the podcast develops me and develops other people is a way that people can use it. They can have it when they're driving, when they're walking, and I just wanted to just jump out there and just say that learning process needs to come at the right time for the student. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to absorb it. I want to just ask you about smoke curtains. You mentioned about smoke curtains there, and I was conscious that we kind of breezed past it, if you excuse the pun. Just double click on that for me. People might be completely abstract. They don't understand what that means. Where do we see these? Because they're becoming a lot more common. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Please tell us what they are and where we might see them, even as members of the public. Where might they see them and not realise what they're seeing?
Okay, I attended a conference in Poland in 2008, and 2014, and I met a guy called Michael Reick. He's a chief fire officer. He's an architect and an engineer in a German fire service. About 3,500.
That's a deadly combination. That's a very useful combination.
But this guy was demonstrating the smoke curtain, and when I saw it first, it didn't really impress me until he told this simple metaphor. He said, when an officer goes to a fire with a limited number of firefighters, and there's a fire in the kitchen, and there's people upstairs in bed, he has a choice with the number of people he has. He can either fight the fire and allow the smoke spread through the structure and hope the people survive long enough for them to be rescued, or he can go with the rescue and forget about the fire, which means he's putting his firefighters in more danger.
That's the big fork in the road, isn't it? That's the fork. So many services, right at that beginning bit, that's where people choose a lane and they separate out. Some people go, is it search and rescue or is it firefighting? What's the priority?
Yeah.
And it's different. It's amazing how people change their priority across the whole world.
Yeah. So he said, if you use a smoke curtain on that kitchen, you can put firefighters in there working away and keep the rest of that dwelling smoke-free, and the people can walk down the stairs. So that to me was so simple and so profound. I took one back from Poland. He gave me one. And then in terms of high-rise firefighting, I want you to think about this, Pete. If we're in a stairwell and we connect into a rising main, and we open a door or two to get to that apartment on fire, smoke is going to fill that stairwell, and people on floors above the fire and below the fire floor will not be able to escape because of our actions.
Absolutely. We've gone with the best of intentions, and we've just opened up the compartment and turned it from one small, because people forget you put hose through a door, the door is permanently open now. You've either wedged it open yourself or you've created a gap, and everything that was in that compartment is on its way expanding into the new one. So
Michael Reick makes a comment, and Paul Grimwood has adopted this because he recognises the meaning of it. The stairwell in a tall and complex building is the most important room in that building.
Yeah.
And keeping that stairwell as a meaningful means of egress or escape is a prime tactical objective. So the smoke curtain allows that to occur. Also, the smoke curtain can be used to manage flow paths. And if there's a wind-driven phenomena presenting, you can use a couple of smoke curtains to keep that event getting into the means of escape. So as part of our standard strategy in Dublin, as a consequence, is we place the first smoke curtain on the stairwell door and the second smoke curtain on the apartment door. And so what we're doing is achieving a prime tactical objective in maintaining means of escape throughout the firefighting operation. So that is the key to understanding smoke curtain.
There's so just for people, obviously this is an audible format, so people may not get that. What that looks like, the ones that we have experienced is we have the ones that are like a telescopic pole that is attached to we say a smoke curtain. It's a heavy fabric that is fire retardant, And you can put it in a door frame effectively, and then the telescopic aspect of it expands out to capture the door frame and then braces itself against it whilst the curtain drapes down, so that we can still go in and out of it, but obviously it stops that heat. And these are also, you see them in larger uses. An example, I didn't realize this, but I'd seen them so many times. Again, when I talk about public, where will they see them? You see these in like shopping centers as well, where if you've got like a large atrium in the middle of a shopping center, and what I mean by an atrium is an open expanse in the middle of a shopping center that will go up 3 or 4 floors perhaps, and you can look all the way down to the bottom. What you might see on either side are almost big, sometimes they'll be there permanently, and they'll be draped down, and you think they're just decorative, but they actually have a purpose. Or sometimes they'll descend from the roof. So in the event of a fire in the atrium or a fire in one of the levels, these will be part of the automatic infrastructure controlled by the fire panel, and they will deploy, and these fire curtains will descend. People can still pass around them or pass through them, but like you say, it stops that smoke rising through the atrium and passing into new floors. So for example, because people will walk from a shopping centre straight into like a clothing department, and it's completely open area. If you've got partially burnt products of combustion in a hot smoke gas, a hot fire gas, rising and then permeating into a new layer where there's a lot of combustibles, like lots of coats or whatever in a certain shop. Once it hits that right saturation, once it hits the right richness, it will combust, and you'll end up getting small fires all over the place, completely, to a different part of the building that you originally thought was the problem. So I did just want to just double click on that, because you gave a great example of how we see them utilized by the fire service, but people will see these more and more around them if they just look for them.
And to give you an idea of the humility of this character, Michael Reick, he told me he was lying in bed with his wife one morning, and he was trying to figure out how to take these commercial applications of smoke curtains, how he's going to bring it to a domestic situation. And his wife said to him, "Would you not just hang a curtain on the door?"
Perfect. We try and overcomplicate stuff, don't we? We're a book of it. We love our complexity. They say the difference between obvious and oblivious is very subtle. Like you say, when children are great for this sometimes as well, aren't they? If you like, kids always come up to you and go, "Daddy, why don't you just do this?" And you're like, "Don't interrupt me. I'm coming up with a really complex way to do this." And they're like, "Why don't you just hang it from the door?" God damn it. I love that.
So that's how it came about.
And the wife was like,
yes,
dear, of course. You do it your way. In the meantime, I'm just going to hang it from the door. I love that. It's a great little side note. I want us to pause there for a minute for 2 reasons. Just able to catch our breath. I'm busting for a wee-wee, so I'm going to go and have a quick wee-wee. Okay. It's just flowing so incredibly well, mate. I really, you're such an incredible...
Hey, can I say something to you, mate? I've spoken to an awful lot of people over the years. You're extremely knowledgeable, you know that? I really think you should expand your horizons. I think you should become an instructor. I think you should be looking to travel. And I think your mentality and your knowledge really will feed in to a succession for people like Paul Grimwood there in the UK. I'm going to say this, and please don't take any negative out of it, because I mean it in a positive way. I've spoken to a lot of UK firefighters over the years, and an awful lot of them are quite insular in their understanding of what's going on. You're not. And I think you know more about this shit than I do.
Firstly, thank you so much. I'm blushing incredibly though, I promise you. I think a lot of that comes for me about, and I've said this before on the podcast, I am more interested in the people than I am with the job. And being able to do that allows me to become much more of an active listener when I spend time with people. Just as a side note, I was actually a drug addict for some time when I was younger.
Really?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I struggled. So I'm an addict in general. I have a very addictive personality. But what happened through my process of recovery was I benefited from a lot of coaches and people that helped me realize that what my addiction really was, I was able to frame it as like a really strong power force. And it was an energy that I needed to find a way to apply to different things. So I went through a lot of personal development. I got a lot of coaching, And as I am the serial addict, I got addicted to personal development and I got addicted to coaching. And I became fascinated with human behavior and fascinated with people, and how I truly understood from a first-hand experience how people could change how they interacted with other people, how they interacted with themselves, and what they chose to focus on and how that could benefit them. So from that, I just fell head over heels in love with people. And then I looked around me, because I was in the fire service, been in the fire service since I was 18. I was in the fire service when I was going through this. And I started looking at the people around me in a very different way and became fascinated with, well, I know a bit more about my human behavior now. Let me talk to you about your human behavior, and let me talk to you about the way you see the world. And that is kind of it's exactly what fed into the podcast. And I just now swim deeper and deeper and deeper into people and their experiences, how they see the world, and that has just naturally manifested itself in becoming fascinated with your experiences. And as I learn more about your experiences, I learn more about the subject matter.
But Pete, I have to say this, that's a remarkable achievement, and it's really, really full admiration. You need to talk to Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, don't you?
Oh, no, she is on my hit list. I approached her about a year and a half ago, and I had a brief interaction with her. I want to have her on the podcast, and I want to have so many people on it. You know, I said it, during our chat, and I may or may not put this in, I don't know, about the fact that I find that we are surrounded by fascinating people, certainly in the emergency services, just the type of people that it attracts. And we actually don't do ourselves justice sometimes when we focus too much on the subject matter. That's why I like to strike the balance of the podcast, because it's so much better in spoken form than written form, because you get so much more of the person with it. Hearing John Chubb speak about his experiences for me is far, and I'm not trying to put down any papers or anything, books that people have written, it's far more authentic hearing you communicate and articulate your experiences. I just love it. I could listen to you for days, because the person and their own passion and interpretation and hearing them speak about their experiences just adds so many layers of depth and authenticity. And yes, people like Sabrina have married that up perfectly, where the way she teaches some of the things in her book and things like that is because she allows herself to include herself within the story. And that's what I want to do with the podcast. That's what I feel like I'm doing with the podcast, is allowing people to develop themselves through the stories and through the learnings and experiences of other people, rather than just the technical data, the technical takeaway. I think we don't do ourselves justice. And again, it speaks about how that kind of self-deprecation aspect, that we are interesting people. I'm in love with the people more than I'm in love with the job. And that's why I love the podcast, because you can't fake it. You can't fake. I mean, we've been speaking for 2 hours now. You can't fake a 2-hour conversation. You have to sincerely be interested in the person to be able to have that conversation. And I love the people.
Fair play to you, Pete.
Hey everybody, we are going to hit pause there on my conversation with John. Again, this is just one of those conversations that is so rich and so deep. We ended up going on far longer than I expected, which is a great thing. But I want to give everybody time to sit and digest what we've been through today. From the equipment perspective, from the smoke curtains to the CFBT to the high-rise to the tall buildings. There's so many great pieces in there from John today. And also, don't forget our giveaways on our social media platforms, our fantastic partner Hikes. And once again, giving away a pair of their fantastic boots. These are the Black Eagle Nature GTX. Similar to my Black Eagle Athletics. Now, I got my Black Eagle Athletics, I think it was January last year. I honestly think I've probably spent no more than 2 days not wearing them. However, for this time of year, the Black Eagle Natures are really ideal. They've almost got, and I'm going to get this wrong, they've got like a thicker, even more waterproof layer on them. So when I'm out in some of this crazy January weather in the UK, my feet are warm, my ankles are supported, and I'm staying dry. If you've ever been out doing any kind of big walking or anything like that, the key to all of this is keep your feet dry. So again, you can get a pair of them absolutely free. Jump over to our social media channels, have a look for the Hikes competition. And also finally, we've got a second giveaway for our listeners. Tallyman, who are the designers of personalized BA tallies. These are the plastic tallies that you get out of all your breathing apparatus sets that go into your telemetry boards or your BA and your control boards, whatever your vernacular is in your service. You can get 2 of those personalized to yourself. This is a free giveaway with our partner Tallyman, so again, head over to the social media platforms and have a look. And a final little favor from me, total transparency, we do track the episodes. We like to see what's hitting. We like to see what people are enjoying. So if you're not already a subscriber of the podcast, be sure to hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening. That helps us stay in contact with you. That helps you keep up to date with the podcast, and it helps us reach more people.
being totally honest, folks, we're doing this because we want to add value to as many people as possible, and you can support us by doing that. That's it from me today. That's it from John. We will be coming back with part 2 very soon, but until then, stay happy, stay healthy, stay hungry, and we'll see you back here real soon on the Firefighters Podcast.